Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 35, The Monster. Warning: this episode contains very graphic information that could be distressing to some. Thomas Jeffrey, surname also recorded as Jeffries, and also known as Mark Jeffries, was a convict bushranger, murderer and cannibal in the mid-1820s in Van Diemen's Land. In contemporary newspaper reports of his crimes, he was frequently described as a monster. When Thomas Jeffrey was executed, an entire island breathed a sigh of relief. He liked to call himself Captain Jeffries, perhaps a nod to his naval roots, or perhaps because he saw himself as more powerful than the law of the land. I came across Jeffrey when Ray Blair told the story of Theo Futrell and his descendants in bonus episode number 4. It may be best to listen to the 3 episodes on Theo Futrell before listening to this one, as there is one incident covered in detail related to Thomas Jeffrey in Ray's story. Thomas Jeffrey was born in 1791 in Bristol, England, the son of a butcher. He received 7 years of schooling, after which he served aboard the British naval warship Achille. After 4 years and 7 months, he deserted from the Navy, claiming cruel usage. Jeffrey then went to London, where he enlisted in the army as a drummer. After 2 years and 9 months, he deserted again and returned to sea on the frigate Leander. In 1814, when he was 23, Jeffrey returned to Bristol, where he began to exhibit sociopathic behaviour, stealing from his father and other relatives before returning to London. In London, he stole from a well-to-do uncle and Captain Dower, a relative of his mother's, before leaving London and moving from one place to another. Jeffrey found himself burning through money, and to combat this, he joined a gang of highwaymen. There were 3 men alongside Jeffrey that were armed with pistols and began robbing farmers as they returned from market. On one occasion between Lincoln and Gainsborough in the East Midlands, they accosted an old farmer who refused to hand over his money. One of Jeffrey's accomplices shot him dead, and they left his body in a ditch, stealing £69 from their victim. The 4 men drank and gambled until they were apprehended near Hull on suspicion of murdering the farmer. They were detained in jail for 6 months and finally released due to lack of evidence. After his release, Jeffrey returned to his hometown, where his sister gave him £5 on the condition that he leave Bristol. He returned to the East Midlands, where he and his 3 accomplices broke into and stole from a house in Nottingham. One of the men was apprehended a few days later, giving information against the others that led to all of their arrests at nearby Leicester. At the time of Jeffrey's arrest in 1817, his occupation was recorded as a painter and glazier. Jeffrey was convicted in the Nottingham Assizes on the 29th of July 1817 for burglary, receiving a sentence of transportation for life. His convict record describes him as 5 foot 8 1/4 tall, with a dark sallow complexion, black to grey hair and hazel eyes. After a period in jail, Jeffrey was transferred to the prison hulk Retribution that was moored at Woolwich on the River Thames, and in September 1819 he was transported to the colony of New South Wales aboard the Prince Regent with 161 other convicts. In consideration of his previous experience at sea, during the voyage Jeffrey had his irons removed so that he could work as a seaman. The Prince Regent arrived at Port Jackson on the 27th of January 1820. Jeffrey was initially assigned to a settler named Brown on the Hawkesbury River. Later, he was assigned to work on a crew of a boat based at Cockle Bay at Port Jackson. One night, he was apprehended by the police for stealing oranges from an orchard on Parramatta River, for which he received 100 lashes and 2 years in the Newcastle coal mines. Jeffrey and 6 others subsequently absconded from a convict work gang at Limeburners Creek near Curragh River, north of Newcastle, and made their way south to the Sydney region. During their journey through the bush, 2 of the escaped convicts were murdered and eaten by the others. The 5 remaining absconders were apprehended when they reached Parramatta. Jeffrey was sent over the Blue Mountains but absconded after only 3 weeks with 3 other prisoners. They made their way to Emu Plains, where they survived by opportunistic stealing. After his companions gave themselves up, Jeffrey joined with a large group of escaped convicts in their cow pastures district, but was betrayed, apprehended and taken to Parramatta Jail, where he was put in irons. Eventually, Jeffrey was taken before the magistrate John MacArthur, to whom he provided information that led to the apprehension of his other companions, who were later sent to the Port Macquarie penal settlement. MacArthur decided to send Jeffrey, the intractable absconder, to Van Diemen's Land. Jeffrey was transported to Van Diemen's Land aboard the brig Hawes, arriving on the 1st of January 1822 at Port Dalrymple at the mouth of the Tamar River. By August 1822, Jeffrey had been assigned as an overseer of a work gang at the Georgetown Jail. On the evening of the 13th of June 1824, Chief Constable George Lawson visited the Georgetown watch house and found one of the prisoners absent. He went to the nearby Ship Inn, where he found his prisoner, Joseph Smith, and returned him to the watch house. When he returned, Lawson was informed by the watch house keeper that Jeffrey, a prisoner and overseer of the jail gang, had been trying to break through the wall with a pickaxe. Lawson went inside and ordered Jeffrey to a cell. Jeffrey was abusive, appeared to be intoxicated and refused to obey. Lawson then left to seek assistance. He returned with 3 constables and ordered them to put Jeffrey in irons. The convict overseer then drew a knife, made several thrusts at Lawson and told them he would stab the first man that should attempt to put him in irons. Lawson succeeded in knocking the knife from Jeffrey's grasp. He was restrained and then placed in a cell. Jeffrey was later transferred to the Georgetown Jail and sentenced to 12 months in the Macquarie Harbour Penal Station for threats to stab Chief Constable Lawson. However, Jeffrey was never transferred to Macquarie Harbour. Instead, he was put to work in a public works gang at Georgetown. On the 1st of February 1825, he absconded from the work gang. Jeffrey's details were published in the Hobart Town Gazette alongside a long list of other runaway convicts. The description given of Jeffrey was 35 years old, 5'9" ¼ tall, brown hair, brown eyes, with tattoos of a castle, hearts and darts, flower pots and several other marks on his left arm. It is likely that Jeffrey was recaptured soon afterwards, with his conduct record noting that he received a punishment of 50 lashes and hard labour in the jail work gang. By April 1825, Jeffrey was transferred further up the Tamar River to Launceston, where he was assigned as a flagellator at the Launceston Jail. This job was usually given to inmates whose cruel streak was considered useful to the governor for keeping others in check by inflicting as much severe pain and injury on others as they could muster. Many convicts viewed the flagellator as a traitor to the convict class, as they had essentially fallen in with the oppressors to break and brutalise their peers. Jeffrey very soon became known as a vicious flogger of men who appeared to delight in the torture he inflicted. It was reported that the commandant of Launceston Jail thinks that by a very severe mode of flogging, it will repress all disorders. To this end, he engaged a very strong man as flagellator. The correspondent claimed to have personally witnessed 2 men recently flogged who were cut round into the throat, under the armpits, on the belly and ribs on the right side. Most, it was claimed, were being punished for trifling crimes such as being too late for muster or absent from work. The writer added, "I am afraid this mode will drive many into the bush. I have heard some declare that sooner they receive 100 lashes they would do something to get hanged." Jeffrey's conduct record states that he was reprimanded on the 24th of May 1825 for neglect of duty. On the 3rd of August he was fined 10 shillings for being drunk and disorderly. By this stage, Jeffrey was referred to as the watch house keeper as well as flagellator. On the 25th of August, Jeffrey was fined half his salary for falsely imprisoning and assaulting Mrs. Elizabeth Jessup, a free woman. The incident, which began on the evening of the 20th of August, was the subject to differing accounts by Jessup herself and another woman, Mrs. Anne Sharman. Common to both accounts is that Mrs. Sharman had been confined to the watch house and Mrs. Jessup visited her there, bringing bedding and food. Sharman described Jessup as being very tipsy and abusive towards Jeffrey. Jeffrey then confined Mrs. Jessup to the same cell as Mrs. Sharman for the reason of her using ill language towards him. Later in the night, Jeffrey entered the cell in an undressed state and attempted sexual contact with Mrs. Jessup, though by both women's accounts he was rebuffed. He allowed Jessup to leave the following morning. On the 20th of October 1825, Jeffrey was fined 20 shillings from his salary for having taken a female prisoner out of the watch house. A correspondent of the Colonial Times later observed, "The treatment of many women who had been placed under his charge in the watch house is monstrous beyond description." In the same article, it was asserted that Jeffrey had boasted of the favour he received from Peter Mulgrave, the Launceston police magistrate, claiming the magistrate would never believe anything against him. So this has become quite dangerous for others that came in contact with Jeffrey. He's been given responsibility, he's been given access to keys, he has the option of imprisoning people at his whim, and he's also got a magistrate that's in his favour. So as typical sociopaths, they come across to people as being genuine, friendly and innocent, and they bring people into their web in order to get what they want. On the night of Sunday, 11th of December 1825, Jeffrey absconded from lawful custody into the bush in company with 3 other convicts, John Perry, James Hopkins and Edward Russell. Jeffrey's companions were said to have been amongst those in custody, and it was agreed amongst them that they should all take to the woods. The specific reason for Jeffrey giving up the position of watchhouse keeper is not known, but on the night it occurred, the escape was expected by police. The police magistrate Mulgrave and a number of constables had placed themselves in an area to detect them in the act of breaking out. There may have been a degree of fatalism in Jeffrey's decision to abscond. On that night, he later stated that he was resolved for nothing but immediate death. Jeffrey had locked the other prisoners in their cells, and as his companions left the watch house at about midnight to begin their escape, they saw the 3 men standing and waiting. They drew back, intending to check the rear of the building, but suddenly a pistol shot rang out and the 4 convicts decided to run, jumping the lumberyard fence and escaping to the long black hills. Jeffrey had departed with a pistol, though in their hasty departure he had left behind a knapsack he had packed. So it's quite possible that those cases of imprisoning those women and mistreating them had started to pile up, and then the police magistrate Mulgrave having his eyes opened a little bit to what was going on. And so I think that Jeffrey realised that he was going to be uncovered and jailed himself, and his watchkeeper responsibilities taken away from him. So this was the decision for him to get out. A little bit on Jeffrey's 3 companions. They had all been sentenced to transportation for life. John Perry was 22. He was a native of Battersea. He was 5 foot and 5.5 inches tall, brown hair and dark grey eyes. He was employed as a bricklayer's labourer, and he was tried for felony in County Surrey in December 1822, and he arrived aboard the Commodore Hayes in August 1823. He had been on the gang of public works at Georgetown in 1825. He violently assaulted Thomas Banks in July 1825, and on November 1825 he absconded from Georgetown, where he received 50 lashes, and he was removed to Maria Island, but it was not carried out in the end due to him absconding from the watch house at Launceston. James Hopkins was 20, a native of Chosedale, County of Gloucester. He was 5 foot 2.5 inches, brown hair and grey eyes. He worked as a stocking weaver and was tried for burglary at the Gloucester Assizes in April 1821. And he arrived aboard the Claudine in December 1821, and he had previously absconded a public works gang at Launceston in March 1825. Edward Russell was tried for burglary at County Surrey. He was a recent arrival to the colony aboard the Medina in September 1825. In need of supplies, the 4 absconders stopped at a hut of a man named Smith at the Springs, 8 miles south of Launceston. Jeffrey bailed up 2 men in the hut and took a musket, gunpowder, some flour and a knapsack. 2 days later, the escaped convicts arrived at a farm belonging to Captain Andrew Barclay on the South Esk River near Perth. 13 miles south of Launceston. At a hut on the farm, they took a shotgun and provisions, forcing the two occupants to walk with them into the bush before releasing them. On the 14th of December, Jeffries and his gang robbed a stock hut South Esk belonging to Roland Lone. As they left, they stated their intention of joining Matthew Brady and his gang. Matthew Brady and his gang of bushrangers were at the time notorious in Van Diemen's Land. They had been at large and active throughout the island for 18 months after they escaped from the Macquarie Harbour penal station on a whaleboat. Their offer to join with Brady's gang was refused. Later on, in early January 1826, Brady's group robbed a settler named Haywood in the vicinity of Hobart, and during the robbery, the bushrangers informed Haywood that Jeffrey had tendered them his services and had been rejected. About this time, the fugitive stole a musket, 30 pounds of mutton and 6 pounds of salt from a dwelling of Joseph Railton at Spring Plains in the Evandale area. After the raid on Railton's place, James Hopkins separated from his companions. Later, Geoffrey, Perry and Russell approached John Batman's hut on the South Esk River. As Geoffrey neared the door of the dwelling, two men appeared holding muskets, but dropped them at the bushrangers' command. Another two men were found inside, one of them injured in bed. After gathering supplies from the hut, they forced the three men, able to walk, to carry the goods for 14 kilometres to the foot of the surrounding mountains, where they were given their freedom. On the 16th of December, the four bushrangers arrived at James Sutherland's Rothbury Run, described as a grazing farm on the Isis River between Cressy and Campbelltown. They evidently felt secure and rested there for about 10 days, feasting on slaughtered stock from the run. On Christmas Day, they looted an unoccupied tent on the property and drank a bottle of rum that they found inside. As the bushrangers were walking away, suddenly a shot was fired ahead of them. As they moved cautiously forward, two men armed with muskets were sighted. Geoffrey told them to drop their arms, to which they responded by demanding their identities. When Geoffrey said who he was, one of the men ran off, and Geoffrey and the remaining men exchanged shots, resulting in the man receiving a thigh wound. As Geoffrey and his companions approached the wounded man, who appeared to be drunk, he began to abuse them. According to Geoffrey's later accounts, as they drew nearer, Russell came up behind and shot the wounded man in the head, killing him. The murdered man was never identified in newspaper reports, described only as Mr. Sutherland's man. The murder and its implications imbued the bushrangers' actions with a renewed sense of urgency. In a hut about 800 yards from Sutherland's house, they found a man asleep. After they woke him, he told them that 7 of Sutherland's men had laid in wait for them in the hut the previous night, and that a number of parties were out searching for them. The bushrangers took the man to show them where to ford the river. After crossing the Isis, they raided Young's residence, occupied by an old man named McShann. They gathered supplies and forced the two captors to accompany them as they escaped into the bush, releasing them unharmed the next day. On the morning of the 31st of December 1825, Geoffrey, Perry and Russell approached two men splitting wood near the hut of a settler named George Bernard that was situated on the Tamar River in the vicinity of the modern Launceston suburb of Rockley. The bushrangers took the two splitters captive but decided not to rob Bernard's hut. Instead, they went towards the house of John Tibbs, who had a grant of land at the swamp towards Mulberry Hill, about 8 kilometres from Launceston. The details of this attack are in bonus episode number 4 related to Theo Futrell's episode. Tensions grew as the groups were matched through the bush, resulting in Russell shooting Beachy, a bullocky, and Perry shooting Tibbs in the neck. Despite being badly wounded, Tibbs managed to escape and raised an alarm in Launceston. Beachy would later die from his wound. On the 5th of January, the colonial authorities approved the offer of a reward for information leading to the apprehension and conviction of an escaped convict, Thomas Jeffries, who was described by Mrs. Tibbs as referring to himself as a captain, and was dressed in a long black overcoat, a red waistcoat, and a kangaroo skin cap. Him and his two unnamed accomplices charged with diverse robberies and firing and wounding John Tibbs. Rewards of $200 were offered for the information, bringing about the apprehension of each of the offenders. A free pardon was offered for relevant information given by a convict under the sentences of the law. After freeing the last of their captives from the raid on Tibbs's farm, the three fugitives followed the Tamar River, heading northwesterly towards Georgetown, near the mouth of the Tamar. One morning arrived at the pilot's house near Georgetown. The bushrangers captured Parrish, the pilot, a sailor and a soldier who had been stationed there as a signalman. After robbing the building of supplies, including the soldier's musket, they headed east with their captives. Later that morning they released Parrish and the sailor, and the following morning freed the soldier. After keeping on the move for about 3 days, the three fugitives met up with William Bruce, a mailman. They took him into the bush to camp for the night and examined the letters he was carrying. That evening they heard a man coo-wee in the distance. The following morning, on the 11th of January 1836, they heard the coo-wee calls again, and Bruce was sent to fetch the man, no doubt with green warnings not to alert the danger about who was waiting for him. When he joined them, the man was found to be Constable Magnus Baker of Georgetown, who had been part of a search party hunting for the escapees and had become separated from his group. They confiscated his weapon and ammunition, tied his hands and loaded him with a knapsack. The bushrangers and their captives then resumed, walking in a southeasterly direction parallel to the Tamar Valley. Later they heard a gun being fired and were compelled to alter their course. Believing the constable had tried to steer them towards the search parties, Geoffrey called him a treacherous rascal. They walked on for about 6 kilometres when Geoffrey suddenly announced he was going to shoot the policeman. Bruce begged for his life, but Geoffrey could not be deterred. As he later recorded in his confession, I went up and put my pistol to his head and immediately shot him. After the constable's murder, the three fugitives walked on for another couple of miles, stopped to eat, and then sent the mailman away. Geoffrey and his 2 companions were compelled to keep moving, with armed parties searching for them in the outlying areas north of Launceston. In the settled districts, they lived on slaughtered livestock and provisions stolen from settlers and stock keepers. However, the landscape they were now travelling through, that was between Launceston and Georgetown, was relatively unsettled. Very few farms in the district were likely bases for search parties hunting them, and it forced them to keep to the wild bush and scrub country to evade their pursuers. After about 3 days of travelling through the bush, they consumed the food they were carrying. After several more days, Geoffrey shot a cockatoo, their only sustenance for the following 3 or 4 days. At that point, much exhausted for want of food, Geoffrey said to the others, this is by Perry's later account, "If you like, the first man that falls asleep shall be shot and become food for the other 2. 2 days later, as they were ascending a rocky and scrubby high hill, they stopped to rest. Edward Russell fell asleep, and Perry, sitting close to him, took a loaded pistol from his knapsack and shot Russell in the forehead, and he expired without a groan. Perry took his knife and cut flesh from Russell's thighs. They made a fire, and they broiled some of the flesh and ate it before moving on. A newspaper report after Geoffrey's capture, claimed to be based on his verbal confession, included a differing version of the events preceding Russell's murder. The account in the Colonial Times described how Geoffrey and his companions, rather pressed for food, lots were cast which of his companions should die, fell upon Russell, but as the man was not armed, he could not effect his purpose until the poor wretch fell asleep from fatigue, when he was murdered and his flesh served the survivors for food for a few days. On the 19th of January, the 2 fugitives arrived at an unoccupied shepherd's hut on Miller's Run. After feeding on the provisions found there, they went in the search of the shepherd. When he was found, they slaughtered 2 sheep and returned to the hut where they cut up the animals. They still had a quantity of Russell's flesh in a knapsack, which Geoffrey later claimed they cut into steaks, fried up with the mutton. Geoffrey and Perry remained overnight at the shepherd's hut. The following morning they reached another hut. They approached it within 20 yards before they realised it was occupied by a stockman and a search party of 2 soldiers and 3 volunteers. According to Geoffrey's later confession, he challenged them to come out, and the first man that handled his firelock, I would blow his brains out. A corporal armed with a musket made an appearance, and Geoffrey fired into the hut and wounded a soldier named Robert Stubbs. At this, all 6 occupants ran from the hut, leaving their knapsacks and firearms. The bushrangers took 2 of the muskets and broke up the rest, as well as tea, sugar, flour and meat, and walked for about a mile into the bush to camp for the night. Taking advantage of a moonlit night and conscious that search parties would be out the next day, Perry took their only pot and went search for water. In doing so, however, he became lost and was unable to find his way back to the campsite. Just as Jeffrey and Perry became separated, one of the original group of absconders, James Hopkins, was captured. On the 21st of January, a soldier named McQuinn came upon Hopkins asleep and unarmed. He was captured and taken into custody. Hopkins had been apart from his fellow escapees for a month after separating from them after the robbery of Joseph Riotton's dwelling at Spring Plains, which was only days after they'd absconded. On the morning of Sunday 22nd of January 1826, 3 separate parties in search of Jeffrey and his companions met up at Mr. Davies' hut on the bank of South Esk River near Evandale. The men were inside the hut preparing breakfast. The parties were made up of men representing district landholders, Davies, on whose land the hut was situated, the surveyor and landowner John Wedge, and the holder of a nearby estate named Cox. An Aboriginal boy with the group, belonging to Mr. Cox, observed a man furtively approaching and exclaimed, "There is Jeffries." Thus alerted, the 12 men remained concealed until the bushranger was within the reach of a musket ball, at which point one of the Davies men and one of Mr. Wedge's party ran out. Jeffrey immediately took cover behind a tree. As the other men emerged from the hut, he asked if any quarter would be given. He was answered in the affirmative by Mr. Wedge's man, a convict named William Parsons, who had him covered with his firearm. Jeffrey threw down his arms, a musket and a pistol, and was captured. The creek where the monster was taken was later renamed Jeffreys Creek and ran under what is now known as Logan Road. The creek has long since dried up. Jeffrey was brought into Launceston about 7 in the evening of his capture. A large crowd had gathered. Men, women, children, free people and prisoners joined in their personal execrations against the monster. The town was almost emptied of its inhabitants to meet the inhumane wretch. Several attempts were made by the people to take him out of the cart, that they might wreak their vengeance upon him. He entered the town and jail amidst the curses of every person, and it was with greatest difficulty imaginable that people were prevented from tearing him to pieces. After Perry became separated from Jeffrey, he kept on the move, robbing from huts as the opportunities allowed. At one of the huts, he was able to procure a musket. Early on the morning of the 31st of January, Perry arrived at Leith's farm near Launceston. As he approached, he was sighted by several of Leith's servants from a distance. Upon drawing closer, Perry realised he had been seen and ran off. 2 of Leith's assigned servants, John Spong and Francis Barrett, set off in pursuit. With the help of 2 little dogs, they followed the bushranger's tracks and at last came upon him, standing with his musket levelled at them. Spong also raised his gun and ordered Perry to throw down his arms, or he might expect no quarter. With this, the bushranger dropped his weapon. He was secured and taken to the homestead, and later that day Perry was taken to Launceston, where Jeffrey and Hopkins were being held. While Jeffrey was incarcerated in Launceston jail awaiting transfer to Hobart for trial, it was reported that he was writing the history of his own life, in which he describes crimes of as deep a dye, perpetrated by him in England and Scotland, and even those committed by him in this island. Colonel Arthur, while at Launceston, saw Jeffrey in jail. His Excellency told him there could be no hope of mercy for such a character, and therefore advised him to prepare for another state. Jeffrey replied in the most cool manner possible that he did not expect mercy, and the only favour he had to ask was that he might be led out to execution with as little delay as possible. His parents, he says, were respectable and religious. Matthew Brady was captured on the 11th of March 1826 near Watery Plains, 15 miles from Launceston, after being wounded in the leg. 2 of Brady's gang members, James Goodwin and Patrick Bryant, were also captured. Brady and his companions were taken to Launceston jail, where Jeffrey, Perry and Hopkins were being held. Jeffrey and Perry, along with Brady and his captured gang members, were transported from Launceston to Hobart aboard the government brig Prince Leopold. arriving at their destination on the 27th of March 1826. Hopkins was probably also aboard. At Hobart, a large crowd gathered to watch as the manacled prisoners were disembarked and marched to the jail on the corner of Macquarie and Murray Streets, where they were all placed in a cell together. In the early hours of the 5th of April, the jailer, John Bisbee, whose bedroom adjoined the cell where Geoffrey and the others were confined, heard a sort of scratching which excited his suspicion. Upon investigation, Bisbee found that the prisoners had scraped out the mortar between some of the bricks using a broken spoon and 2 knives with the intention of making a hole in the wall. 2 nights later, the prisoners made another attempt to escape, after which the jail authorities had them chained to an iron ring bolted to the floor. On Saturday, the 22nd of April 1826, Geoffrey, Perry and Hopkins were tried and found guilty of stealing the gun, 30 pounds of mutton and 6 pounds of salt from the dwelling of Joseph Relton. On the same day, Geoffrey and Perry were tried for the murder of John Tibbs, the 5-month-old son of John and Elizabeth Tibbs. Geoffrey was found guilty of murder and Perry was convicted of being present, aiding and abetting. On the night of the 25th of April, Brady, who was still sharing a cell with Geoffrey, told James Dodding, one of the turnkeys at the jail, that if Geoffrey was not taken from his cell, he would be found in the morning without his head. As a result of this warning, Geoffrey was moved to another cell. While Jeffreys was known to those in Tasmania as the Monster, Brady was actually known as the Gentleman. One time when Brady and his men took a family prisoner, he sat them down around the dining table, fed them, and even took care of their horses. After dinner, he collected up their watches, rings, money and other valuables, thanked the family profusely for their hospitality and rode off. Above all, Brady would not stand for any of his men harming a woman, and he banished him. Brady's hatred was so intense for the loathsome Jeffreys, and it's quite likely why Brady decided that Jeffrey's gang was not going to join them. In the days leading up to their execution, Brady was sent gift baskets of flowers and fruit from his adoring fans, and on the gallows the women wept for the gentleman Brady. None wept for the monster. It was reported that Geoffrey had at last taken to the Bible. He had sent for the Anglican minister, William Bedford, and had been crying like a baby. In the confession made prior to his execution, Geoffrey laments the responsibilities given to him after his relocation to Launceston. He said, "Where drink was the total ruin of me, I was made watch-house keeper, a situation unfit for a drunkard." On the 27th of April, Geoffrey and Perry were tried for murder of Magnus Baker, the constable, for which Geoffrey was found guilty. Perry was found guilty on the second count and not guilty on the other. On the 29th of April, Justice Petter sentenced Geoffrey, Perry and Hopkins to death, along with 9 others that included Brady, Bryant, Goodwin and 5 others of Brady's gang. Geoffrey appeared much agitated after the sentence was passed. The death warrant was issued on the 2nd of May, ordering the execution of Geoffrey, Perry, Brady, Bryant and a murderer named John Thompson to be held on the Thursday, the 4th of May, 1826. At 8 o'clock in the morning of the execution, the sheriff brought the condemned men into the jail lodge to undergo preparations. Geoffrey was the first to be led out, accompanied by Reverend Bedford. It was reported that Geoffrey appeared firm and composed. As his arms were pinioned, the murderer prayed fervently and seemed really penitent. The other prisoners were also led out, and all 5 ascended the scaffold. Reverend Bedford addressed the crowd that had collected in great numbers outside the jail, saying, "The unhappy man Jeffreys, now before you, on the verge of eternity, desires me to state that he attributes all of the crimes he has committed and which have brought him to his present state to the abhorrent vice of drunkenness." With the necessary preparations in place for all 5 men, Bedford commenced reading certain portions of the funeral service. When he came to a particular passage, the drop fell, and this world closed upon the wretched men forever. With the bodies of Geoffrey and Brady taken down from the gallows, Dr. Scott, the colonial surgeon, took plaster of Paris casts of their countenances. Geoffrey was buried in an unmarked grave in Hobart. The following morning, 6 members of Brady's gang of bushrangers were hanged, making full use of the 6-man gallows at the Hobart jail. James Hopkins, who had also been sentenced to death, received a reprieve, and his sentence was commuted to transportation for life. An important factor in granting the reprieve was probably the fact that Hopkins had separated from his fellow absconders before the murders and before the heinous crimes had begun to be committed by his 3 companions. In December 1826, Hopkins and 12 other prisoners were transported aboard the ship Woodford to hard labour in the penal settlement of Norfolk Island. Over a span of 40 days, Jeffrey and his gang of convict absconders were responsible for 5 murders, characterised by extreme violence. However, if all the depositions and confessions were accurate, Jeffrey himself unquestionably murdered only one of the victims, the Constable Baker, on the 11th of January. As the leader of the group, he was at least complicit in the murder of infant John Tibbs, and it was he who initiated the taking of the child from his mother's arms. It was either he or Russell who committed the horrendous act of killing the infant, but both men were certainly culpable. It was Russell who had set in motion the series of killings by murdering Sutherland's unnamed employee on Christmas Day, and a week later mortally wounding Isaac Beachy. Despite his crimes, very little has been attached to Russell, probably because he himself ended up a victim, shot in the forehead by Perry, his body butchered and his flesh consumed to sustain his former companions. When details became known of the probable sexual assault of Mrs. Tibbs and the killing of her child, contemporary newspaper reports began describing Jeffrey as a monster. On the 7th of January, the Hobart Town Gazette referred to him as that monster in human shape, the murder Jeffreys. On the 20th of January, the Colonial Times referred to the monster Jeffreys as this diabolical villain. After he was apprehended, the colonial newspapers celebrated the capture of this worst of monsters in human shape. As Jeffrey was being marched in manacles from the docks to Hobart Jail, along with Perry, Brady and members of Brady's gang, a correspondent to the Hobart Town Gazette detected evidence of Jeffrey's depravity in his face, stating, "Jeffreys is a monster in countenance as in heart, but Brady and his associates have nothing ferocious in their aspect, nor anything that would lead us to apprehend the dreadful acts they have perpetrated." After Jeffrey was sentenced to death, there was a distinct change in tone towards the murderer, with contemporary press reports more likely to refer to indications of his repentance and alluding to him as one of the group of unhappy men that were to be executed. In his confession, Jeffreys had a lot to say about his life in England. He gave details on other attacks he made. He even directly spoke of his cannibalism. But of the events of that New Year's Eve, all he had to say was, "I can tell you no more on that. The great God, I hope, will forgive the 3 of us."
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.